Chapter 14. The Battle Against Ignorance. As the collective learning feedback loop accelerated human progress, it soon led us to a time that changed human existence forever. From the emergence of civilizations to only about 500 years ago, we lived in a world geographically divided into 4 distinct parts: Afro-Eurasia, the Americas, Australasia, and the Pacific Islands. Even though they were not connected, they all did their own collective learning and ended up taking the same paths: agriculture to large civilizations. Not surprising, the Afro-Eurasians group was where the most collective learning could take place due to their larger landmass and thus populations. The creation of the Silk Road and other such mediums allowed connectivity between even the most furthest apart cities. Slowly, the fruits of trade were so evident that European states most westward, like Portugal, wanted to find better trade routes to the east, to places like India. This kick-started the European explorations in the late 1400s. The infamous Christopher Columbus embarked on his journey to find a route to India via the Pacific, but instead ended up bumping into the Americas. This event, in spite of coming with several atrocities, finally united the world into one global society. Simultaneously, a new way of thinking spread across the world. Today, we call this the scientific revolution. This is kind of misleading, because we see an abundant understanding of how the world works in several ancient civilizations, such as in China, India, and even Greece. But the one thing that was different this time was that science was taken mainstream. In other words, people could now start thinking for themselves based on the facts, rather than believing blindly what was told to them. Today, we credit the start of this paradigm shift to a man named Nicholas Copernicus, who proposed the idea that the Earth rotated around its axis, and further revolved around the Sun. This idea was not new, as a similar version of it was proposed more than 1,000 years before by the ancient Greek Aristarchus of Samos, who lived around the time of Aristotle. However, what Copernicus did do was explain it in such a way that people heard him and understood it. To give you some perspective of how backwards we were at the time, the authorities, which was basically the church, had made concepts like the Earth being the center of the universe as an infallible truth. To go against that idea was like undermining God as a whole. He knew his ideas would stir up so much tension that he waited until his deathbed to publish his ideas. And even then, a friend of Copernicus prefaced the book by saying, as paraphrased by the brilliant Carl Sagan, "Dear reader, when you look at this book, it may appear that the author is saying that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. He doesn't really believe that. You see, this book is for mathematicians. If you're not one, close the book. Mathematicians find that if you wish to know where Jupiter will be in 2 years, you can get a good answer by assuming the Sun is at the center. There is a mere mathematical fiction. It does not challenge our holy faith, and please don't have any emotional anxiety while reading this book." See, up until then, majority of the people were illiterate, as books were a luxury good only accessible to the educated elite. Even though writing had been invented a long time ago and did greatly benefit collective learning through the communication of complex and abstract ideas, circulation of written material was almost impossible at large scales. For every copy, a book had to be handwritten, and the potential to make a mistake was incredibly high. As a result, most knowledge was still orally transmitted. However, when Johannes Gutenberg invented his version of the printing press in the mid-1400s, it finally allowed the mass distribution and better preservation of knowledge through generations. To put things into perspective, more books had been printed in Europe in the next 50 years than had been hand-copied in the last 600 years. The easier spread of knowledge and the increased connectivity between people from all over the globe triggered a new way of determining what knowledge meant. Up until then, facts were mostly dependent on what your religion told you through its sacred texts. But soon, people like Francis Bacon introduced the concept of the scientific method. In other words, how to determine if something is objectively or only subjectively true. The method that is still used today. One asks a question, evidence is gathered, theories are developed, more evidence is sought, interpretations are debated, and then conclusions are drawn. This paved the way for many great ideas in the following years, such as the invention of the microscope, an understanding of the human body, Sir Isaac Newton's laws of physics, and many more. However, one concept, and the one most fundamental to the way we live life, did not change: the way we harness energy. Our state-of-the-art technology for energy harvesting was still agriculture, and our most effective form of production was through the use of animal and human muscle power. Of course, it all changed after the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. This too, because of the way we are taught in school, is pretty misleading. It was more of a global revolution triggered by global collective learning. Nothing would have been possible without the foundation laid by the worldwide network of trade. Nevertheless, a good place to start the journey towards industrialization would be Britain. To be more specific, with the optimization of the steam engine by James Watt. Going back to our good friend carbon, as we learned before, all life is made up of it. Over hundreds of millions of years, dead bodies sank deep into the crust. Eventually, the high pressure and heat converted the carbon-based structures into what we know today as fossil fuels. These came in the form of coal, oil, natural gas, and were basically enormous stores of natural energy. The discovery of their potential led to an explosion of inventions and productivity very similar to that of the Cambrian explosion. At the time, we now had a seemingly unlimited supply of cheap energy. Watt figured a way to harness the massive energy in coal to power a vehicle, thus giving us the first trains. A significant improvement in the connectivity between potential innovators. Big History Lesson 6. One of the great-grandchildren of the Industrial Revolution is the social media platform Instagram. More specifically, the photograph part of it was one that was made accessible to the masses due to the innovations of the Industrial Revolution. It was George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, who first allowed the common person to capture memories. But who was he, and how did he figure this out? Well, he was a high school dropout who never studied chemistry. But every night he would read international photography journals, as there was no internet back then, and would experiment with any resources he could come by. Eventually, he would go on to create the first affordable and reliable camera for the masses. In this story lies a very simple lesson. A lesson that has never been more true than it is today. To quote Mark Twain, "Do not let your schooling interfere with your education." Another famous example of this is none other than Albert Einstein. He too failed his college entrance exam. Later in life ended up working at the Swiss Patent Office, then got rejected when applied to be a university lecturer, and also got rejected for being a high school teacher. Imagine if he let any of that discourage him to pursue his passion for learning. Moral of the story: your only obstacle to living a fulfilled life is not achieving the best grade, but finding a problem that, until you've solved it, will self-motivate you to get out of bed every morning. Back to fossil fuels. The immense energy available through them allowed us to demonetize and mass produce items that are now deemed necessities to us privileged enough to be born post the Industrial Revolution. Before, the average life expectancy was only around 40 years. The fastest anyone could travel was as fast as a horse could run. Disease and famine were almost a guarantee in every person's life, no matter how wealthy. And about 80% of the world lived on farms. The refrigerator, the flushable toilet, electricity, steel, cars, telephones, and basically almost every gadget we use today in our daily lives is a product of the Industrial Revolution. We don't think much of this period of time, but it is what has enabled us to live the lifestyle we live today. For 99.99% of human existence, life was radically different. And we must appreciate the simple fact that we are alive at a point in time where our basic survival requirements, for the most part, are taken care of.